I appreciate the opportunity to be invited back to the Nooksack Basin in Whatcom County to share some thoughts. Before I do that, though, I have a couple of questions, and it's going to require you to be able to raise one or the other of your arms. How many of you live in the Nooksack Basin? How many of you work in the areas of the Nooksack Basin? How many of you have children that live in the Nooksack Basin? How many of you hope to have children or grandchildren live in the Nooksack Basin? How many of you farm, fish, recreate, gather shellfish? You are neighbors. You are Nooksack neighbors. You may, you may not know each other, but that is a reality. The question before you is whether you're going to take care of your neighborhood, the Nooksack Basin. Now, there's not a basin in the western U.S., and I've probably worked in about 30 of them, that isn't trying to redo its basin in part to change things from the way they were approached in the past. Every basin has a history, every basin has a texture, every basin has relationships, some of which are positive, some of which are quite negative. So one has to take into account that history. But the question is, are you going to be controlled by the history, or are you going to move on to a better place? That's the first question you need to answer as Nooksack neighbors. And am I going to be stuck with things that didn't go right in the past and relationships that either never existed or were broken, or am I going to move beyond that as a good neighbor? Sounds like oh sure, we can all be in favor of that. The truth is, in many areas in the western United States, people haven't moved beyond that. I've still worked in basins where people wouldn't go in the same room with each other, notwithstanding the fact they were neighbors, notwithstanding the fact that if they didn't work something out, they were both going to lose. But the history got in the way of a solution. So when I was asked to come back up here and just a moment about myself and this area, I was a trustee at Western for 12 years. I worked on forestry issues up here, water issues up here, mediated issues with the Lummi tribe related to Orcas Island and Madrona Point, and the Lummi tribe in the port of Tacoma. Worked on water issues up here when I was Governor Locke's water policy advisor. Our firm represented the Lummi Island landowners during the issue about the ferry service. So I feel like, at least over time, I have some understanding of this area. But I've been away for a long time. I've been working in other areas. So what I'd like to do is give you 3 things to keep in mind if you actually want to do something. And in society today, I divide people into 2 categories. One are those who like activities. They like to get together and chat, they like to think about things, and they don't do squat. And I'm not interested in spending a lot of time with activity people. I look for people that want to take action. If you want to take action collectively, then you can get some important things accomplished, and I'll give you some examples. But I would suggest to all of you in this room that as you think about your neighborhood and you think about this ecosystem and you think about the Nooksack Basin, the question for yourself is, am I going to be an action figure or am I going to be an activity observer? And just make up your mind. There's nothing wrong with either one. It's just you're one or the other in my book. And you got to choose. Nobody's going to make you. You have to decide for yourself. So let me give you 3 things out of about 40 years of doing negotiation and mediation in water and energy and agriculture and fisheries that I believe would be of assistance to you. The first thing is constructing a framework for your neighborhood, for your Nooksack Basin neighborhood. Where do you want to be somewhere down the road? And I say a framework because a lot of the details may change, a lot of the projects may get modified, people will come and go. But if you don't have that framework, you don't have the ability to really be able to say this is an important opportunity or not an important opportunity. We are making progress or we're not making progress. So I define a framework as outcomes. What outcomes do you want to see 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Every successful area that I've been involved with has had a framework. So I want to give you one example out of the San Joaquin Valley in California. They had a huge area where the groundwater had been used and created a giant empty space. And a number of the leaders in that community said, you know what, we could turn that into an asset as a groundwater bank. And people said, well, you know, I don't know how you'd ever get that done. Well, the long and short is they got it done. They had to deal with their other neighbors who were already using their own groundwater so they wouldn't disadvantage them. They had to deal with other state contractors who had concerns about it. But they took the time to put together a system to make that framework function for them. Before this last drought, they put 800,000 acre-feet of water into that groundwater bank. And the reason they only had to plow up half their orchards during this last 3-year drought in California was because not only of that water bank, but once it was done and understood, there are now 12 groundwater banks in the San Joaquin Valley. There were none before that. And when these leaders started with a framework and then followed through with the actions, they created a wonderful, wonderful thing, which, by the way, also serves as intermittent habitat for migrating bird species. And there used to be T-shirts in Bakersfield that said a riverbed runs through it, because every summer the river would go dry. Once they had the groundwater banks, it occurred to some of them and myself, well, you could run water down the river, the Kern River. Guess where water goes in a gravel-bottomed riverbed? Into the ground. They now have water throughout the entire season that used to be dry. So it serves a recreation purpose and it serves a water security purpose. Without that framework, they would not have been successful. The second thing that's needed is within that framework, you have to achieve interim successes. You know, the centrifugal forces in our society are tending to pull people apart, not put them together. At least everywhere I've been. You all may have a different experience, but that's what I've observed. So for those who value their neighbors, even if their interests are different than theirs, it's always a challenge because people at home are saying, what are you doing spending all that time with them? They don't care about us. They're not going to do anything that's going to matter to us. You're wasting your time. You're wasting your energy. They're just suckering you along and then they're going to leave you standing once they've got what they want. Many years ago, after I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office implementing the Indian Treaty Fishing Rights decision, the Bolt decision. I got to know many of the tribal leaders around the state. After I left the U.S. Attorney's Office, I got hired by the major companies in the state who had watched the war go on the water. And now the question was about habitat. And they didn't want to go through the same, get keel hauled. And I wrote a paper up for them about why all their general counsels thought they ought to go to court. And the paper had a box score at the end. Tribe success in court, state success in court, starting with territorial court. It was 20 in the tribal column, 0 in the state column. So 2 interesting things happened out of that box score. One was the general counsels all shut up for a while and said, I guess we'll let Waldo, crazy as he is, go try this thing. On the tribal side, the people I worked for said, give that paper to the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission. And the commissioners looked at it and said, we've been winning in court for 100 years and we're not getting what we need for our fish. So maybe we ought to try something different. We can always go to court. Those fundamental understandings led to about 25 years of people working together to do some pretty remarkable things. But we needed action. There was a Lummi leader up here, Dutch Kinley, whom I'd gotten to know. And we were trying to get everybody, all the tribes together to agree, and the timber companies and the ag interests and people that finance them and the irrigation districts. And finally, Dutch said to me, you know what, Jim, if you keep trying to get everybody together to start this thing, it ain't ever going to happen. He said, let's find a couple of basins where people actually want to do something together and do it. If it doesn't work, then we tried and, found out it didn't work. But if it works, everybody else will want in on the action. And that's what we did. So in this basin, framework, number 1, series of actions that in fact benefit the basin and the people you are intending to build into a coalition to get the job done. By the way, I hate the word stakeholder. I hate all the bullshit that state and federal agencies go through to do what they're going to do anyway. The question is, do you have a coalition? People can be in and out of government, in or out of business, in or out of environmental groups. Is there a coalition that's knit together? They may disagree on some things, but is that coalition really together in moving things or not? And if you've got it, you're going to succeed. And if you don't have it, I'm not optimistic about the opportunities. So now I'd like to talk about the last thing, which is relationships. I can tell you with complete certainty that with relationships, many, many things are possible amongst neighbors in building a coalition, having a framework and moving forward. And if you do not have the relationships, then you can have the best framework in the world as a matter of science and looking at it. You can have some wonderful ideas about things that possibly might move you forward. You probably won't succeed without the relationships. So I want to just tell you a couple stories to illustrate that. When I was Governor Locke's water policy advisor, I had 3 people from the Walla Walla Basin ask if they could meet with me privately. One of them was Bill Queets, who was with the Umatilla tribe. One was Rob Caldwell with an environmental group, and one was Bob Rupert, who's worked in a business in Walla Walla. Said, sure, we can get together. And so we did all the normal chatting and visiting, what's going on and all that. And finally, I said, did you guys have a point to the meeting other than just wanting to kind of get together and enjoy my company? And they said, well, yes, we do. Can you keep the state and federal agencies out of the Walla Walla Basin for a year? I said, Rob, I thought you were with an environmental group. I said, you want me to keep, now you have the ESA listings in the Walla Walla Basin. The Umatilla tribe has been working to restore salmon fisheries in all the basins in the Columbia that they care about. And so they said, yes. We have developed a relationship. The Walla Walla headwaters are in Oregon. So you have 2 states and all of that. And they said, we've developed some relationships across the state border that we think will solve the biggest problem in the Walla Walla Basin, which is for 100 years, that river went dry for about 60 days in the middle of the summer. The Corps of Engineers solution was to cement that part of the riverbed so the water would go over it. The three of them thought that made no sense. The Endangered Species Act was going to cause everybody to go into their foxhole and hire their lawyers and lawyer up. And they wanted to see if they could put together a better solution. I said, you know what, I believe in backing leaders. You all seem to have that kind of relationship and have some idea what's going to be done, so let me see what I can do. And if you need help, at least out of the state agencies, let me know, and we can talk about it, see what we can do to help. I'm going to jump ahead to the end of the story. They rewatered that basin, kept it rewatered during the drought when I was Governor Logs. The farmers figured out how they could operate in such a way to do that. And just as a quick side story, 3/4 of the way through, the Corps of Engineers is meeting with these farmers who figured out how to use their systems when they weren't farming to recharge groundwater. And the Corps said, well, maybe this is a good idea. And everybody in the basin's rolling their eyes a little bit. But we'd have to study it before we'd know exactly more about it. And this farmer, Ron Brown, said, well, I'm not as educated as you are, but around here, water tends to run downhill. And he said, the kind of soil we have, water's going to go through it, and it's going to run downhill, and the river's right down over there. We think if we put some water in up here in the ground, it's probably going to show up in the river. So he said, you guys can do your studies. Meanwhile, we're going to work with the tribe and do this on a bigger scale. They reintroduced Chinook salmon, which now return to the Walla Walla after being absent for 100 years. The riparian species, muskrat and others, have now come back to the Walla Walla Basin. The farmers have a secure water supply. The city of Walla Walla has secure water supply. And it was because of a coalition built around those three people that trusted each other and knew they were going to help each other get to the right place. You can do the same thing here. You have succeeded at a number of things that I've seen. You have some others you've tried and you've not succeeded. By the way, this is not the first or the last time that may be true for you or anybody else. My experience has been you learn more from the things that don't turn out the way you intended than when everything goes very smoothly. So there are lessons to be learned there if people want to move on. I'd like to close by talking a little bit about the Nooksack itself. And although this isn't about climate change, I do want to talk about climate patterns in the Nooksack Basin. Every basin from the Sacramento River north that I have seen information on changing climate patterns says we are likely to have the same amount of precipitation. However, we're going to have much more. Mother Nature will not be storing water the way she is. So we are going to have bigger runoffs in the winter, longer, drier periods in the summer and early fall, as a general rule. So this is not good. And by the way, it's not good for any of the neighbors in this basin, but it's particularly not good for the salmon and steelhead resources. So you need water in stream and you need cool water. Cool water tends to come out of the ground into the river. So I'm a big fan of ways in which water can be, that can be done, and in a big scale and a small scale. The irrigation entities that were formed in this basin, I believe, Henry, were formed as drainage ditches, drainage entities initially, because there was too much water on the land. Water on the land, too much. bigger rain events, drier or later, maybe there's an asset there, not just for the farmers, but for all the neighbors. Just maybe that could turn out to be one of the major pieces here. The second advantage you have for about another 2 or 3 years is you have the mayor of the largest city in this neighborhood, Mayor Linville, who happens to be the most informed mayor on water and the realities of water of any mayor in the state of Washington. And I know that because I worked with Kelly when she was chair of that committee that dealt with water issues in the House. And your city seems to have, the big city, Bellingham, seems to have a very good working relationship with your county government and your port. And I know for a fact in many places in the state, including up here, that's often not been the case. That's a tremendous potential, another part of putting action together, informed action. And then lastly, I want to talk about, and I'm sure Mr. Solomon, who's on the Tribal Council, will be on the panel later today, will be speaking to this. But the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe have some very, very long institutional meaning through the tribal members as well as their technical staff's knowledge on a lot of these issues. And they feel themselves in a very threatened situation. Threatened because the main source of income historically for the tribe in fishing is not nearly what it used to be. Habitat is going to take a long time to change things. The question is whether there'll still be a fishing tribe when that occurs. They need help. They need allies. And in the shellfish that's currently their best source of revenue, the question of water quality is a vital one. And if things can be done in that area, then I think that's one of the things that could cement together a coalition. And a coalition that could be very powerful. So I appreciate the fact that you're all here. I appreciate the opportunity to share these thoughts with you. And I think I'm out of time, right?
Yeah, we've got time for questions.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Oh, good. Okay, questions.
Well, I'll ask a question. I'm Eric Hurst from Bellingham. One thing you didn't mention that I think is sorely lacking in Whatcom County is leadership from some government entity. And my perspective is that either the county or ecology, or better yet, both, needs to step up and say, we're going to take responsibility for this. What I see are a lot of actors, many of whom are well motivated, as you're pointing out, but they're operating kind of as independent orbits. It's not well coordinated. And I'm a little bit surprised, and I'd like your comment on whether you think it's enough if a few people get together and say we can coordinate and do this on our own, whether you really need some government entity to step up and take leadership. Thank you.
Short answer is obviously you need governments to step up. You need institutions to step up. Governments including tribes. You actually need entities, also I would say significant entities out of the environmental side and the business side. I will say to you though that I would start with either the local governments, or if there are people in ecology or the Department of Health or other state agencies, individuals that are really vested here and want to put in that extra time, they can be critical. But the ecology as an institution has to cover the whole state. And their attention tends to get drawn from one crisis to another, understandably. but that means you don't have the sustaining power to keep after these things, unless there's some individuals in those agencies who provide that here. But yes.
Yes. Your comment about finding solutions brings to mind efforts that Randy Kinley, Dutch's nephew, been working on for a number of years, knowing that same score of what you win in court versus what the other side loses, and the fact that you don't want to really fund that many lawyers' kids' educations. But we ran into the situation in the county to the south of us where there was very deep concern about water and agricultural problems, and there was no dialogue. But we talked to the farm group down there, and said, you got all these drainage channels, why don't you think about regulating them to the point that it's below the root zone, but it holds the water for a period of time. It also prevents fish from getting into areas that are probably not habitat. And so that's one of the solutions that might put water in the ground, because the longer you keep the water on the land, the better off you are. So there are solutions out there, but you need to try them out. Another one is some of the drainage ditches you bury with having pipes where everything that goes into the pipe basically is filtered through 3 feet of dirt, which seems to clean things up pretty well. And you can also regulate the water in a pipe system like that. None of these are really in the current management scenario, and they all have bureaucratic handicaps. But there are ideas out there.
I'll tell you, I'll give a similar example, which Alan, being the youngster he is, may remember. But I mediated an agreement called the Timber, Fish, and Wildlife Agreement. And when we got to the issue of culverts and stream crossings, we had the biologists trying to tell the forest engineers how to build their roads and bridges and culverts. And we had the engineers of the forest company trying to tell the biologists what the fish needed to get through. And after this had gone on for a while, we decided to have a little session with role reversal. We said, why don't you fish folks talk about what it is that would be important in terms of more optimum conditions for fish to get through? And how about if you forest engineers, once you hear that, talk about what options do you have to accomplish that? And quite a remarkable thing happened. The fish folks actually stuck to their fish stuff. And once the engineers understood that, they said, oh, we can think of 5 or 6 ways of doing that. In some cases where they had a temporary or seasonal road, they'd run a flatbed railroad car across a little stream and pull it out when they were done, when you had high flows. In other cases, they said, you know, we've been using too small a culvert. Costs us as forest landowners because they keep getting washed out. Now we can use what you want to go to our boss and get the budget to put in bigger culverts, half culverts, let the stream bed be in the bottom. So what Alan talked about would be an interesting conversation with the farmers about what kinds of things might be done. And some of them are going to have an expense attached to them, maybe not a big one, but an expense. And that's something the coalition could get behind and say, we're going to go keep looking around till we find the money to try these things and then expand them if they work across a broader area. And if you had the right coalition pushing that, I believe you could find the money somewhere to do that. But the point is, you've figured out what you want to do, and you've got a coalition that people are going to pay attention to, and people can see, well, gee, if it could work there, maybe it could even work in other areas of the state. Anyway, thank you very much. I want to let you all be able to stay.